Hey, U.S. History kids, welcome to your first ever flipped video lesson. And our first video is going to be a short one, a little review of Reconstruction after the Civil War. On Friday, we looked at what some of the problems were in the country after the Civil War, based on some documents. We're going to kind of go through how we start trying to fix some of these problems. And one of the things we'll see is that westward expansion developed as part of these as well. So think to yourself real quick, what do you remember about the list of the conditions after the Civil War? A lot of bad things are going on, right? I mean, we have you think about stuff from Friday, things about the remembrance of injuries and the visual of people with lost limbs, arms, legs, those kind of things. We have a lot of city population density. We have a lot of issues with destruction in the South, trying to rebuild, literally rebuild the buildings of the South, those kind of things. And top it off, you have issues with newly freed slaves and how that's all going to work out. And so one of the things we're looking at in this little short video here is one, how do you rebuild the South? How do you put things back together? How do you fix the government? And what do you do with these new freedmen? Those being the former slaves that are now free men in the United States. And so first I'll talk about the plans that they had for putting the country back together. A little review here, obviously. Obviously, President Lincoln had one plan. He'd be Lincoln, of course. His plan was kind of a quick, easy fix after the Civil War. Further, he wanted to pardon all the people who seceded from the Union. Everyone from the South who left, he said, "Yeah, we're going to bring you back, welcome you back in," kind of like burying the hatchet a little bit, if you will. He also wanted to allow all the states that had left back into the United States if they met certain conditions. First off, they had to withdraw their secession, basically saying, "We're sorry we left, we're sorry we busted away, please let us back in," kind of thing. The state had to swear allegiance to the Union. So basically, states had to say, "Hey, we want to become part of the United States again. We're going to be loyal to the United States forever, never, never. Pinky swear," that kind of thing. Next is they had to cancel all the war debts. All these states during the Civil War racked a big war debt. Get rid of them. Okay, get rid of the debts to the war. Next, they also had to make sure that they would ratify the 13th Amendment. That would be the amendment that abolishes slavery in the United States. The state had to do that as a way to make sure slavery would not make a comeback. And lastly, he even said, kind of like made a little deal here. The rich Southerners, guys who run the place, told them that they would not have to make the allegiance oath as a way to kind of like win them over, if you will, and make sure they would agree to it. Now, unfortunately for us, we know Abraham Lincoln's plan did not go into effect because, well, Lincoln got shot. And so that was one of the big things that kind of led to that not happening. So obviously, when Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, Andrew Johnson takes over as his new president, and the Johnson plan was a little different. All right, it was much more severe. He basically didn't want any rights for anyone who was worth more than $20,000. Kind of way to almost like punish those who had broken away from the Union. He really wanted to try and take away power from the rich class in the South and make sure they couldn't, find a way to leave the Union again, really, and take a lot of the property away. It's kind of hamstring them, if you will. And his plan kind of went into action with Lincoln's. They made sure slavery was gone. They passed the 13th Amendment that will be on quiz at some point, guys. Okay, making sure that slavery was gone forever. Okay, they repealed the Articles of Secession, so all the states that had said we're leaving, they got rid of those articles saying we're leaving and we're part of the country again. But there were still bigger problems going on in the Union at this time. And one of the new things that was passed was something called the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act was a law making sure that all the new rights given to African Americans, voting, citizenship, being able to run for office, those kind of things. This is a law that was passed to make sure that, law passed by Congress, to make sure that those things can't be taken away. And so we want to make sure that that's not going to happen. Now, President Johnson, on the flip side of this, vetoed that act. He said, we're not going to pass this law. He said it went beyond the powers of the Constitution. He said that the Constitution should be doing this already. Why do we have to pass a law that makes it happen? That was his argument. That's what it is, okay? So the Civil Rights Law, the law was going to protect African Americans, make sure that their rights weren't taken away, was vetoed by Johnson because he said that idea is already the Constitution. We shouldn't have to worry about that at all. He said it was almost kind of like, beating a dead horse with that idea, okay? Now, the response is that it angered a lot of his supporters in Congress. The guys in Congress that wanted this law to be passed, well, they got mad about it and really started this big fight between Congress and the president. Now, if you guys remember from government or from what you guys did in 8th grade or in middle school or whenever, or a government class, we had government class already. Laws got to be passed by Congress, then okayed by the president. The two can't work together, then things don't work out so hot. And things weren't working out so hot this time. And so one of the things we see happen is that Congress kind of makes their own plan without the president, and they want to really punish the South. They want to make sure the South pays for leaving, seceding, and having the war take place. And so they create these military districts. You see the picture over here, which shows where all the military districts are. And it was basically, the states were basically being run by a general, and the states would be let back in when they wrote a brand new constitution. And so the states had to rewrite their state constitution. Every state has their own constitution, along with the United States. And that constitution had to have in it that it gave African Americans the right to vote. Now, obviously, Johnson vetoed this law as well, because he felt that it was unconstitutional and that the Constitution, the job already did it. Well, he was overruled by Congress, and the law went into effect anyway. Now, as part of this whole fight here, President Johnson was impeached. President Andrew Johnson was one of two presidents that have ever been impeached while they were in office. Obviously, impeachment is a check and balance, so Congress can get rid of the president if they feel he's doing bad things in office. Congress stated that Johnson was not doing his job. The job of president is to enforce the laws. And this Reconstruction Act to put country back together, Congress accused him of basically not enforcing that law when he violated a 10-year service act and got rid of some people in the government, including the Secretary of War. Essentially, Johnson came about as close as you can come to being impeached. They had this big, huge trial about Johnson, and he was impeached. He was convicted in the House of Representatives. Okay, he was impeached in the House of Representatives. They vote to put him in under impeachment, but then it comes down to the Senate, and the Senate has to have a 2/3 vote. So 2/3 of the senators have to vote to convict him and kick President Johnson out of office. Well, the Senate does their vote one by one by one by one by one. Comes down to one vote essentially. The very last person to vote voted to not impeach Johnson, and the Senate was literally one vote short of convicting Johnson, kicking him out of office. And so it's kind of one of the big scandals of the time. So obviously, we see politics-wise, things aren't working so hot in this part of the world. Now, one of the things that these states do are called the Black Codes. It was basically a way for some states to get around all different civil rights laws. And the goal was to make sure, the goal in these states was to make sure that African Americans could not vote. And so one of the methods they used was called a poll tax. Like it says, basically you had to pay a fee to go and vote. A lot of African Americans had been slaves before that, and so they had really no money. There's no way they could afford to pay to vote plus pay all their other bills. So it was a way to kind of encourage, for states to encourage African Americans to not vote. And so these big, huge poll taxes, so that the only person that could actually vote would be the rich whites. Also, something called the grandfather clause. They made this clause saying that if your grandfather could vote, so can you. Well, think about it. For these new freed African Americans, all their grandfathers, most of their grandfathers, I should say, were slaves. That means they could not vote, which means if their grandfather didn't vote, they can't vote either. So they're kind of like, finding a loophole in these laws, if you will. Last one was something called a literacy test. And a literacy test was basically you take this really, really hard test to pass it, to be able to vote. You have to pass this test to be able to vote. Make the test so the states made the test really, really hard, and they also graded them sometimes unfairly. Sometimes they would grade them, for whites differently than they would grade them for African Americans. So it caused a lot of trouble there, and it was really, really tough for African Americans to get ahead in the South. A lot of times we saw violence too. In the 1870s, a group called the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK, started. Originally, it was just a big social club for Confederate veterans, but they also wanted to intimidate African Americans and stop them from voting and stop other people from helping out African Americans in the South. So they would ride around at night. They wore hoods and masks to scare people, to hide around and scare people, and try and force African Americans to not vote. Eventually, the violence got to a point where other groups started to threaten to kill anybody that helped African Americans. They did all kinds of nasty stuff. They burned buildings. They destroyed fields and crops and farms. And if you were caught doing business with an African American person, they would hunt you down too. So it really, really affected politics as well, because if the voting at this time wasn't necessarily all secret ballot, it wasn't always a secret who you voted for, and so these guys would be standing outside who you're voting and say you're voting for this person or else, kind of thing. It was a lot of intimidation, almost like terror, if you will, a little bit. They intimidated people into doing what they wanted, and so it played a big role in this whole idea of the violence of the South in this time. And so it's a big part of what we see happening in this part of history as well. Last one I'll talk about here is the idea of sharecropping and tenant farming. This gets really started in the South in the 1860s as well. A lot of these old Southern big plantation owners, it had, slavery is abolished, slavery is gone. They have a lot of questions. First of all, where are these former slaves going to go? They don't own their own land. And secondly, whose land are they going to farm? And so the planters were really afraid that they would not make a profit out of slaves because they have to pay for all this labor. So they started doing sharecropping. Sharecroppers would rent their land to poor whites or freed slaves. They give them tools, seed, those kind of things, and then the tenant would owe the owner part of the crop. So if I was doing this, I would, basically have to, I would get stuff from the owner, and then what I paid back to them was giving him a good chunk of my crop. The rest of the crop that was left over, I could sell. But, a lot of times there wasn't a lot of crop left over. So if you're sharecropping, basically you're renting land and getting the tools and the seed, but you're giving a lot of your crop to the person who owns the land. You also your tenant farming as well, where poor whites freed slaves, they rent the land. They rent the land from rich planter for cash to keep all their crops. The problem is you don't have a lot of cash to start up with. And so sharecropping, tenant farming started to make problems here. Start creating what we call a cycle of poverty. Essentially, basically, if I'm doing this, and we put a circle in here to kind of show this cycle of poverty here. If I'm a sharecropper, if you will, so here's my circle here. I'll move it over. If I'm on my circle here, if I'm a sharecropper, okay, and so we'll put me in here as best we can. Here's me, okay, right there's me, okay. I'm starting off here, and I'm trying to get money to buy my own land. Now, unfortunately, I don't have enough money to buy my own land. Here might be my kid. Well, I have no land to pass off to my kid, so he has to rent land as well. My grandkid then comes along eventually, and there's not enough money for him to rent to buy his own land either, so he is stuck renting land as well. And essentially, this idea of cycle of poverty, if I can put my next the generation in here, there we go. Essentially, you see all the way around, you have this cycle of poverty where nobody can ever actually get ahead. And so it kind of just keeps the idea of cycle of poverty going. In some places, they did try to find ways to help us out. It was a program called 40 Acres and a Mule. Essentially, it was promised to African Americans who helped the U.S. Army, the Northern Army, Union Army, during the Civil War. Essentially, land was taken away from big Confederate landowners and given to African Americans. Unfortunately, the African Americans got the worst land. The land they got was nasty, swampy, gross land, and they gave them 40 acres of land and a mule. That's all they got. The mule obviously being what you used to farm, like a tractor back then, I guess. And so, it was really hard to try and get ahead, and really hard to try and make things work. This is just a little review of here in terms of the idea of a little review here of Reconstruction. Please make sure your notes are done for me for Tuesday, and we'll talk about these in class a little bit. Thanks a lot, guys. Appreciate it.